"Strip naked and lie down, fat girl," Mountain Man commanded, but he was saving her from frostbite. "Strip naked and lie down, fat girl," the Mountain Man barked, his voice raw and urgent against the howling storm. Seraphina Caldwell's eyes fluttered open. She didn't understand where she was, only that everything hurt, and her body was frozen to the bone. The world around her blurred into white. Snow clung to her lashes, her dress was stiff with ice. She thought she was dying. When she tried to speak, her lips cracked. Please, don't. Do as I say," the man thundered. "Your clothes are killing you." That was how the last surviving daughter of Boston's Caldwell family, once kept behind marble walls and silk curtains, found herself trembling in a stranger's cabin high atop Frozen Peak, stripped of everything she'd ever known. The man who had found her was Tobias Northwood, known only to the nearby townsfolk as Bear, a recluse who had buried his wife and child under an avalanche years ago and swore never to save another soul again. Until tonight, when Bear had discovered Seraphina lying unconscious by the frozen stream, her heartbeat barely a whisper, the doctor in him had returned to life. He carried her across the mountain in his arms, through biting wind and waist-deep snow, whispering between gasps, "Don't die on me, girl, not again. I can't lose another." Now, as she lay before his fire, too weak to fight and too terrified to understand, she thought he was some madman trying to take advantage of her. But he was trying to save her life the only way he knew how. That night, the storm outside raged. Inside, 2 lives began to thaw. Before that night, Seraphina Sarah Caldwell had never known cold, not the kind that cuts through silk and flesh until it reaches the soul. She was the youngest daughter of a wealthy Boston merchant, raised to play piano and speak softly, not to run through snow or fight for her life. But privilege could not protect her from cruelty. Her family had locked her away in an asylum on the city's edge, not because she was mad, but because she refused to marry a man twice her age, a banker who wanted her dowry more than her heart. Her father had called it correction. Her mother had turned her face away. On a moonless night, with the help of a kind nurse, Sarah escaped. She ran north, following the tracks of a supply wagon heading toward the mining camps near Frozen Peak. But when the wagon broke down and the driver abandoned her, she wandered into the mountains alone. Then came the river, icy, merciless, and she fell. By the time Tobias Bear Northwood found her, she was barely alive. Bear had once been a doctor, one of the best in Denver, before the avalanche that took his wife and son. He had treated every wound but his own, and when the pain became too much, he vanished into the wilderness, choosing solitude over memory. For years he had lived with only the sound of wind and wolves for company. He had promised himself never to care again. But when he saw the girl lying half buried in snow, her lashes frosted white, something broke inside him, something that refused to stay numb. In his cabin, lit only by firelight, he worked with steady hands. He stripped away her frozen dress, cut the cloth that clung to her skin, and wrapped her in thick wool blankets. He placed warm stones near her feet, water bags by her sides, and rubbed her arms until color returned. When she stirred, fear flashed across her eyes. Where am I?" "In my cabin," he said simply. "You fell through the river." "Who are you?" "Someone who doesn't want to dig another grave tonight." Sarah tried to sit up, but the world spun. Why did you, why did you make me? Because if I hadn't, he said, voice low and firm, you'd already be dead. She looked at him then, really looked. The man before her was massive, broad-shouldered, his beard streaked with snow and sorrow. His eyes, green as pine in winter, carried a sadness deeper than the mountain itself. I thought you were going to hurt me, she whispered. He met her gaze without flinching. Not everything that sounds harsh is meant to harm. Sometimes it's how you survive. He turned back to tend the fire, his silhouette framed by flickering light. The room filled with silence, not the cruel kind, but the kind that made her realize she was safe, at least for now. That night, while the storm raged outside, Sarah drifted into sleep, wrapped in warmth that wasn't just from the fire. It was from a man who had forgotten how to care, and a girl who had never been cared for. And when dawn finally broke, Bear knew one thing for certain. His quiet life in the mountains would never be the same again. The next morning, the storm had softened into silence. Snow blanketed the mountains like a shroud, glittering under pale sunlight. When Serafina awoke, she didn't recognize the world around her, only the steady crackle of a fire and the smell of pine and smoke. Bear sat by the hearth, sharpening his knife, his profile calm but unreadable. He hadn't slept. When he noticed her stirring, he set the blade aside. "You're awake," he said quietly. "Good. That means the worst has passed." Sarah tried to move, but her body ached as if made of stone. "My clothes," she began hesitantly. "They're drying," he said before she could finish, "and you'll get them back once they won't kill you." Her cheeks flushed pinker than the firelight. "I wasn't accusing you," she murmured. He gave a small nod, neither defensive nor apologetic. "Didn't think you were." Bear poured her a bowl of hot broth, thin but warm and rich with wild herbs. When he handed it to her, his rough hand brushed hers. She flinched slightly at first, then relaxed when she realized the warmth was real and safe. As she ate, he studied her quietly. "You don't belong out here," he said. "City girl like you, running into the mountains alone, you're lucky I found you before the wolves did." Sarah looked down at her bowl. "I wasn't trying to die." "Then what were you trying to do?" Her lips trembled. "Escape." He didn't press her. He'd seen that look before, the look of someone who had already lost everything worth explaining. That day, when she was strong enough to walk, he helped her outside. The cabin stood on a ridge overlooking a frozen valley, the river glinting like glass below. The cold bit at her skin, but for the first time she felt something almost like freedom. Bear walked beside her, pointing out tracks in the snow. "See that?" he said, crouching. "Rabbit. 2 sets, one fresh, one older. The newer one's your dinner, if you're quick enough." She frowned. "You want me to hunt?" He smirked slightly. "You plan on eating pine needles instead?" Her gasp of disbelief turned into a reluctant laugh, and something inside him softened. He hadn't heard laughter in years. Over the following days, Bear taught her how to move through the snow without sinking, how to find dry wood under wet logs, how to tell edible roots from poisonous ones. She fumbled, fell, and failed, but she never gave up. "Again," he'd say when she missed her mark with the bow. "Your hands are too soft," he teased one afternoon. "You grip like you're holding a teacup." "I'm trying," she snapped, cheeks flushed with effort. "I know," he said, softer this time. "That's why you're still alive." By the end of the week, her aim steadied, her fingers blistered, and her laughter came easier. At night, When the wind screamed outside, they shared quiet meals by the fire. She'd tell him stories of Boston, the lights, the music, the dresses, and he'd listen without interrupting. Then she'd ask about his life, but he always looked into the flames and said, "That's a story for another night." But Sarah saw the shadow behind his silence, the grief that still held him prisoner. One evening, she found him outside, staring at a small grave marker near the tree line. Snow had begun to fall again. She didn't speak. She simply stood beside him, her hand slipping into his. He didn't pull away. For the first time in years, Tobias Bear Northwood didn't feel the mountain closing in. He felt it breathe. And as the storm returned, two hearts, one scarred, one mending, began their journey not just through winter, but through each other. Winter deepened. The forest that once seemed cruel now wrapped itself around them like a living thing, wild, silent, and watchful. Inside the small log cabin, warmth flickered from the hearth, painting gold across the timber walls. The rhythm of survival became their new heartbeat. Each day began before sunrise. Bear would stoke the fire, while Sarah bundled herself in furs and helped prepare breakfast, coarse bread, dried meat, and whatever stew they could manage. She had burned her first few attempts badly enough to fill the cabin with smoke. But Bear never raised his voice. He only grunted and said, "We'll try again tomorrow." And so they did. One morning, she surprised him with a pot of rabbit stew so fragrant he stopped mid-step. "Where'd you learn to season it like that?" he asked, his tone caught between suspicion and admiration. "I didn't," she said with a shy smile. "I guessed." He took a spoonful and nodded slowly. "You guessed right." From that day forward, Sarah cooked. Bear hunted. They moved around each other with a quiet understanding. Two souls who had forgotten what companionship felt like, now finding rhythm in the ordinary. When the storms howled outside, Sarah mended his torn shirts by firelight while he carved wood, bowls, spoons, sometimes small figurines. One evening, she noticed he'd carved a tiny wooden bird. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "For someone?" He hesitated. "For no one anymore?" She reached out, her fingertips brushing the carving. "Then maybe for someone now." For the first time, Bear looked up at her. Really looked. The woman who had once been fragile and trembling now sat calm and sure, her eyes glowing in the firelight. He realized she no longer looked like a stranger. She looked like home. The days grew longer. Together, they repaired the roof, built new shelves, and cleared the path to the river. Sarah learned how to chop wood, though she could barely lift the axe at first. "You'll hurt yourself," Bear warned. "Then I'll learn faster," she shot back, sweat on her brow. When she finally split her first log clean, she spun around in triumph. "See? Not hopeless after all." Bear chuckled, a deep, rough sound that startled even him. "Never said you were." That night, they shared a rare bottle of whiskey he'd kept hidden since his Denver days. He poured her a small cup. "To surviving," he said. She lifted hers to meet his. "To living." The liquid burned, but it made her laugh, and that sound filled every quiet corner of his world. Over time, something unspoken began to bloom, fragile, hesitant, yet undeniable. Their eyes lingered longer, their silences grew softer. When she brushed his hand by accident, he didn't move away. When she smiled, he found himself smiling too. But every tenderness came with hesitation. Bear carried guilt like a second skin. He'd failed once to save the people he loved, his wife and son, lost beneath snow. He couldn't dig fast enough to reach. He'd buried more than their bodies that day. He'd buried his heart. Late one night, when he thought she was asleep, Sarah heard him whisper a name into the dark, a child's name. She didn't speak. She only turned toward him, her hand resting quietly over his. In that moment, he didn't pull away. The next morning, she woke to find the cabin already warm, a pot of coffee waiting, and a single carved wooden bird beside her bowl. "For you," he said simply. "You reminded me what it's like to start over." Tears filled her eyes as she held the small figure close. "Then I'll remind you every day." Outside, the snow continued to fall, endless, silent, eternal. Inside, two broken souls rebuilt something stronger than survival, trust. And though neither said the word love, it lived between them. In the way he checked her gloves before she stepped outside, in the way she waited up until he returned from the woods. Love had come quietly to Frozen Peak, carried not by words, but by the warmth of a shared fire and the simple act of choosing to stay. Spring came late to Frozen Peak. The snow melted reluctantly, uncovering moss, wildflowers, and memories long buried beneath the ice. For the first time in months, Sarah could walk freely through the clearing without sinking into snowdrifts. Yet, with the thaw came more than sunlight. It brought shadows, too. She had been dreaming again, dreams of the asylum, of the men in white coats, of her father's cold voice saying, "You're an embarrassment to this family." She would wake in the middle of the night, trembling, her fingers clutching the blanket as if it could protect her from the past. Bear noticed, though she tried to hide it. "You talk in your sleep," he said one morning over coffee. "You call out for help." Sarah froze, the mug trembling in her hands. "I didn't mean to." He shook his head. "Didn't say you did, but someone hurt you bad enough to still haunt your dreams." She looked down, voice barely above a whisper. "They locked me away because I refused to marry. Said I was hysterical, unfit to decide my own life. The doctor there, he used to drug me until I couldn't remember my name." Bear's jaw tightened. His hand clenched around the mug so hard it cracked. "And your family allowed that?" "My father paid for it," she said bitterly. "Said I'd thank him one day." He set the mug down carefully, the rage in his eyes unmistakable. "If that man ever comes here, he won't leave breathing." Sarah looked up sharply. "Bear, don't—" "I'm not threatening him," he interrupted, voice steady but low. "I'm promising you that he'll never hurt you again." His words should have frightened her, but they didn't. They felt like a vow carved in stone, yet danger didn't need to find her through her father. Sometimes the mountain itself carried whispers. One afternoon, Bear returned from a supply run to the nearest trading post, his expression darker than she had ever seen. "What happened?" she asked. He hesitated, then said, "There's talk in town. A group of men came through, bounty hunters from Boston. They're looking for a missing woman, said she's dangerous and unstable." Sarah's blood ran cold. "They mean me." Bear nodded grimly. "They showed your likeness, offered money for anyone who could lead them to you." She staggered back, her heart hammering. "What are we going to do?" Bear didn't hesitate. "We'll do what we always do. Survive." For the next few days, the cabin became a fortress. He reinforced the doors, set traps along the forest path, and hid supplies in a secret cellar beneath the floorboards. Sarah tried to help, but the guilt weighed on her. "If you hadn't saved me," she said one night, "none of this would be happening to you." He turned sharply. "Don't you dare say that? You think I regret it?" Her eyes filled with tears. "You could lose everything. I already lost everything once," he said, voice rough. "This time I choose what I keep." The confession hung between them, heavy as the mountain air. She stepped forward, placing her hand over his heart. "Then let me help protect it." For the first time, he didn't stop her. When the bounty hunters came, it was just after dusk. They were 3 men, armed and overconfident, following the faint smoke of the chimney like wolves to prey. But they didn't know that Tobias Northwood had once fought in the Civil War, and he had no intention of surrendering again. From the tree line, he struck first, silent, precise, merciless. Within minutes, the snow was still again, broken only by the crackle of a dying fire. When he returned to the cabin, Sarah met him at the door. Her eyes searched his face, the man who had saved her twice now, first from the cold and now from the ghosts of her past. "Are they gone?" she whispered. "Gone," he said simply. She trembled, not from fear, but from the realization that no one had ever fought for her before. That night, when Bear held her close by the fire, she whispered the words that had been buried in her chest for months. "You don't just save lives, Bear. You give them back." He pressed his forehead to hers. "Then promise me you won't run again." "I'm not running any more," she breathed. "Not from you, not from anything." Outside, the last snow of the season began to fall, gentle, forgiving, like a benediction on everything they had survived. The peace didn't last. Spring thawed the snow, but not the danger. 2 weeks after the first attack, word came through a passing trapper. There were more men on their way from the east, better armed and far more determined. "They've got papers," the trapper warned Bear grimly. "Say she's a fugitive from a mental institution. Promise a fortune to anyone who brings her back." Bear thanked him, but when he turned toward the cabin, his expression had already hardened into iron. He'd been through war. He knew the look of men who came not for justice, but for blood. That night, he and Sarah sat together by the fire, not in silence, but in shared fear. The crackle of the logs couldn't drown the pounding in their hearts. "They'll come here, won't they?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "They always do." "Then maybe I should leave if they find me here." "Stop." His voice was sharp, then softened. "You think I'd let them take you? They'll have to go through me first." Tears welled in her eyes. "Bear, I can't let you die because of me." He took her hands, rough and scarred, but warm. "You didn't make me save you that night. You didn't make me love you either. Both happened because I chose them." The words hung heavy and raw, the first time either of them had spoken that truth aloud. By dawn, the hunters came, 5 this time, armed with rifles, their boots crunching through the melting snow. They shouted for her surrender, waving their warrants like victory flags. "Hand her over," one yelled, "or we'll burn this place to the ground." Bear stood in the doorway, his frame filling it completely, a rifle in hand. "You try that, and you'll never see another sunrise." The leader sneered. "You're protecting a lunatic, Doctor." "She's not the one who's sick," Bear said coldly. "You are, if you think you can take her." The standoff erupted in chaos. Gunfire split the morning air, echoing across the valley. Bear moved like a shadow, every shot deliberate, every breath controlled. 2 men fell before they even reached the porch. The others scattered for cover, shouting curses swallowed by wind. Inside, Sarah loaded spare bullets with trembling hands, passing them to him through the door. "I'm not hiding," she said. He looked back, pride flashing in his eyes. "Didn't ask you to." When the last shot rang out, silence reclaimed the mountain. Smoke drifted through the clearing, curling into the sky like a ghost set free. Bear lowered his rifle, his chest heaving. Sarah ran to him, throwing her arms around him before he could speak. "It's over," she whispered against his shoulder. He rested his chin on her hair. "No," he said quietly, "it's beginning." Because as the ashes cooled, the mountain, once a prison for his grief and her fear, became a fortress for their love. They had fought for it with everything they had, and neither the law nor the cold would ever take it from them again. Weeks passed. The snow finally melted into rivers that whispered through the pines. The forest bloomed again, alive with color and sound. What had once been a place of exile now breathed like a living heart, and in its center stood a cabin that had known both death and rebirth. Sarah hung fresh linens on the porch rail while Bear repaired the fence. Their days no longer felt borrowed. They belonged. There was laughter now, soft and unguarded, echoing where silence used to rule. That evening, when the last light of the sun spilled gold across the valley, they sat together on the steps, watching smoke curl lazily from the chimney. "Do you ever miss the world out there?" Bear asked. She smiled faintly. "No. Out there, I was someone's burden. Here, I'm someone's choice." He looked at her then, really looked, the fire in her eyes, the strength in her hands. "You were never anyone's burden, Sarah. You just needed someone strong enough to remind you." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "And you needed someone to remind you that saving a life isn't the same as living one." He chuckled softly. "You always were the better doctor." The wind carried the scent of pine and rain. Somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, not in threat, but as if announcing something sacred. That life, against all odds, had taken root here. Inside the cabin, the fire still burned, throwing light over 2 cups of tea waiting on the table. It was simple, small, and perfect. "You're safe here," Bear murmured. Sarah closed her eyes, smiling through a tear. "It's home now, if you'll have me." He kissed her forehead, his voice steady. "I already do." And as night settled over Frozen Peak, the mountain finally exhaled, holding their secret love in its quiet, eternal heart. Every time I read stories like this, I'm reminded that love doesn't always begin with beauty or perfection. Sometimes it begins in the coldest, loneliest places. Serafina and Bear found each other not because life was kind, but because they refused to stop believing that kindness still existed. If you've ever been through darkness and thought you couldn't survive it, remember this story. You're stronger than you think. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And if you still believe in love that heals, don't leave. The next story is for you.